Right. Okay. So good morning, everybody, and thank you all for being here on a busy day around that. I haven't seen that video before, but it's really impressive, isn't it, in terms of some of the things we've done. Although the last bit being part of the equation brings me back and gives me sort of nightmares about my maths A level many years ago, and so hopefully not too many equations today. So thank you again to Nikki and Claire and the team from ecda who brought this together, and of course for all you being there, and of course Fiona Henderson, who you will see on the screen as well, Assistant Chief Officer, who's with me, and we're going to jointly present some of the things that Essex Police are doing. I hope demonstrating how we use data, to reduce harm across Essex in terms of those bits, and it's a really important part of what we do. So I'm guessing, just because I check in, we're on to the next slide. That can be seen, can it, in terms of that? So the policing landscape. I mean, you can read for yourself some of those issues, just running through them. Knife crime up nationally, but some of the work we've done in Essex is actually down in Essex, although that's pretty difficult for any victim or family that's been been impacted by knife crime. We have had some success through data, and you'll see some of that today, about reducing crime overall. But of course, there's still some huge challenges. Vulnerability-based demand increasing, exploitation, as we read and see, and experience, of course, in our communities, and mental ill health increasingly linked to crime and policing. And of course, cyber and technology is now a feature of every single thing that we do. And this is, of course, based upon a rising population, increased expectation. If all of us use Amazon or whatever websites, know we can get things pretty quickly, and that public expectation. New crimes, stalking, phishing, catfishing, and all of those things, as well as old crimes, assaults, theft, and abuse that take place. So, of which data is a clear and an essential dynamic, both in catching the people and preventing it, but also in the people who do and commit the crimes and hurt people. Back in 1829, Sir Robert Peel talked about a number of principles, preventing crime being more important than catching criminals, although that's of course important. I would say that I'm the Chief Constable, but of course whether those principles back in 1829 stand firm today and are as applicable to the data world, where prevention is better than cure, that we need to work with communities, and you saw around collaboration to work with communities, although those communities are different. and of course the cross-border nature, both national, international, particularly when it comes to data and crimes involving technology. And of course the challenge there is, it stresses across all of our systems and all of you, hence why, working across, ecda and with partners is so important, as you'll see from the case studies. And of course that's with some significant challenge to policing around policing with consent. None of you, and certainly I, never failed to read the newspapers or the news each day to see how policing with consent is challenged. It's not in this county, without complacency. 2/3 of people, or 3/4 of people in this county, have got confidence in Essex Police, and I think that's because of some of the work we do with partners like ecda. But of course, data, the proliferation of data, the culture, the understanding, and of course, importantly, the ethics of its use are really important issues, particularly when you talk about law enforcement and crime and disorder. The idea of Big Brother, is not far away around when we should use data to prevent and solve crime, as opposed to when we could simply use it, is an important consideration for us. And of course, the use of data is not discrete to any one of these areas or any one crime. It proliferates across. There is intersectionality around data in all of these things, and that's why really data literacy has never been more important. So if we can just flick forward another slide, please. Policing's always had data, and there's some indicators there, from the left there. I don't know where that's drawn from, but that's an old log of some description from Essex Police. You can see the handwriting there. Very few things get written, and probably not as neatly as that anymore. But of course, as soon as we've been able to put pins in walls and on maps to plot, we have done that. Now, of course, you see in the centre using, very, very complex digital techniques to do that, and to build associations, whether that's of people, of telephone numbers, of associations, and of locations, and we use that, and of course it's in every area, from the most complex murder or fraud investigation right the way through to those crimes that involve two people, perhaps a domestic abuse. There really is no crime that doesn't have a data or digital footprint now of some description, which becomes relevant. And of course the scale, if you look at the bottom left there, a murder case, if you imagine a sort of a moving box, from when you've moved home, you could have 100 boxes of data and information, of bits of paper, to present a case to a court with all that. Now that kind of data is not only reduced, it's now digital, which is, there's efficiencies in saving, not least of which the trees that make the paper, but also about the accessibility and the ability to access this data and use it to get insights and information. About an 85% reduction, we think, in the amount of paper we generate in terms of this, and of course that stuff is much more searchable, and it plays a crucial role. So if we can flick forward again, please. So, I mean, you see that in some of the headlines and bits we picked up there, but data and some of the challenges for us and the roles there, the infrastructure. We need to have detection equipment and the ability to understand, infiltrate, and assess data. We need to be able to download that data quickly and speedily. We need to store it. The issues of data that I'm sure plagues us all around our phones, and how much we can keep on there with our videos and things, is an issue for us, particularly when you're talking about many thousands of gigabytes, sometimes terabytes of data. Cloud access, where do we keep it? How do we keep that securely, with all of the issues of security, some of that national and operational security, but also personal data that we hold. And of course those things like cryptocurrency, how do we infiltrate those to ensure that we can be able to use that data to secure the assets of those who are profiting from criminal activity, and the things like the dark web, where we know there is a marketplace and a facilitator, sometimes unseen, of criminal activity. And that leads on to what's the skills of our people. And that's why things like today are really important about the data literacy. We need to understand the systems being used. And sadly, we're always going to be one step behind the hackers and the geeks. And that's not because there's any lack of expertise in policing or law enforcement, but because simply they're not restrained either by cost or by legislation, and they can push boundaries that rightly we have to consider and be aware of. And of course, some of the key issues, as you'll have seen from the online safety bill, issues of encryption, end-to-end encryption, are real challenges for us about understanding how that works, so that we can respect the personal nature of that data and the security, but also be able to access it to protect and prevent harm in society. And then in real practical terms, some of the expertise, and you will know from, across this partnership, the salaries that can be commanded by those who have got expertise in data and data analytics, in the private sector for commercial means. So we are reliant really on the sort of trying to make sure that good people stay in the public sector, where perhaps we can't pay those salaries because of the value that they add to the societies in which they live. And the issues of storage and license, all of those have cost implications. But I think one of the biggest challenges, and we talked about role of data, is about the legal framework. What can we do? Where does the law allow us to go? Online safety bill is a good example of where that's still being discussed and argued over. We know the agility of criminals and those who seek to exploit to just step outside of the rules and to push the boundaries. And this debate around could we do it or should we do it? And I think there's some good examples where we could have access to data which we know could allow us to intervene. But actually, given the scale of proportionality and the privacy there, should we be actually intervening into that space? And of course, some of that's in across the private and public realm, which increasingly is blurred when people are living their lives, whether that's relationships and most private lives or in a digital media space, but equally where they're doing their daily transactions from shopping to various other bits. Around that one. And of course then there's just the sheer scale of it, and I think it's some of the data you'll be familiar with, but I'll say it here, if we were to take a domestic abuse case, for example, where we think one person has been abusing, stalking, or another, and we think that evidence is on the phone, if that's a 32 gigabyte phone with a memory on there, and that's potentially 16 million pages worth of A4. So it's on the someone else. That's pile it up, and it's 5 times the height of the shard. So of course that's the sort of complexity of where are the gems that are in there that we need to do. And you'll have seen many of you, I'm sure, around this idea, and I use it, that where victims of particularly sexual offences have been, digitally raped, and I think was the phrase to quote it from news media. How difficult it is to make sure we get that proportionality right. That could we do it? Of course we could, or should we do it? And the expectations that we should know, everybody. So go to the next slide, please, if we can. There we go. But that gives us opportunities, and you can see some of those. Despite the fact we're overrun, despite the fact how it's scrutinised and the skills gaps that we do, we have got some opportunities, and using advanced data analytics and data capabilities to actually understand and use that information to give us greater insight and to spot trends, to spot things that are happening. That perhaps when you're seeing 1 or 2 of these things and it's written down on bits of paper somewhere, that you won't see that, to identify risks that we possibly hadn't seen, or because we blend the data and take a look across various perspectives, that we're able to say that actually here's a risk we didn't see because it hadn't presented in the right format for one agency, particularly policing, or where we can see that it's an indicator that somebody's at greater risk or is a greater risk. And we can see the changes over time. We can see those rising tide trends that allow us to decide how are we going to intervene, whether we can gather more information, whether we're able to monitor information. And I think, the parallel I would suggest, and I've got a good friend who works in genomics and talks about the use of data from the NHS to identify, and how it's been used to identify some of the significant improvements, that we've seen in some chronic and long-term diseases. Now, there is an opportunity, for us in the use of data, considering those ethical issues, to understand how we use that to analyse trends and to identify prevention opportunities across a whole range. And that's not just in the criminal justice sphere, but a whole range of opportunities that allow us, together with the wider system partnership, to actually reduce harm and allow us to intervene and prevent that harm happening. Now, of course, there's always an ethical question about when and where do you intervene, and why do you intervene, and whether what efficacy can be about the data or the insight you've got. And that's an ethical judgment. I think that's really important that we do that. But of course we have seen, we see from health all the time the intervention around things that are not related to critical illness. Those interventions which might be about diet or exercise, or things that are pretty far away from a medical intervention, can assist in the health and well-being of an individual or a community. And I think somehow, in some ways, what I hope that Fiona will showcase is a couple of examples where not quite as profound as some of the medical trials, but I think it can demonstrate how some of these things are coming together within Essex Police, led by Fiona and by officers and staff with partners to actually say, how do we prevent and reduce harm using data? So if I can, I will hand over, and Fiona's going to talk you through a couple of actual case studies of what we have done.
Thank you very much, Chief. And can you just give your thumbs up to make sure you can hear me? Can you hear me? Yep, perfect, brilliant, thank you. So really good segue, actually, thank you, Chief, into that whole prevention and intervention piece. And I'm going to take you through a couple of examples of where we have been using data differently, as Mr. Harrington describes, to understand how we can identify risk and harm, how we can prevent it, how we can intervene with it if it's already happening. And like he says, we're at the beginning of that journey, but actually we are making incredible progress in this space. A lot of what we've done has been recognised nationally by the Chief Scientific Advisor, who advises on science and innovation and technology for all of policing, as well as a number of academic institutions as well. And we really are breaking the ground in a lot of areas. So I'm going to talk about two examples. One is person-based and one is geography-based, but hopefully they both show how we have been using data differently to tackle some really complex issues that reach out across the system. They're system-wide challenges, and just highlight how important it is to have the right data, to have the right interactions with partners in order to address those challenges. So the first one of those I'm going to talk about is the knife crime vulnerability model. And just by way of background, really, I'm sure you don't need me to tell you how much of an issue knife crime is across society. There's a few headlines there on the right-hand side of the slide. It's not a new phenomenon, is it? Knife crime has been troubling us for decades and decades, and actually we saw a peak in knife crime in around about 2019, 2020 across England and Wales. So not specific to Essex, but across England and Wales. Important to note that recording changes did take place shortly after that, so we do need to be quite careful with stats. I'm sure you're all aware of that when we look at those trends, but we did notice that peak just prior to the pandemic. A few other bits that we know, just by way of background, we know that recent figures show that a higher proportion of convictions and cautions are handed to first-time offenders. So that tells us something about how we are dealing with and managing knife crime, but again, could be interpreted differently. So either we're spotting those risks earlier and getting on top of them at an early stage, or there are more first-time knife crime offenders coming into the system, and we really need to understand that, and data will help us do that. We also know from the crime survey in England and Wales that a few years ago, about 6.5% of 10 to 15-year-olds knew someone who carried a knife, and a similar percentage for 16 to 29-year-olds as well. We need a little bit more recent data to bring us up to speed, but that gives you an idea of the volume and proportion of younger people who know people who are carrying knives, and that's something that we need to be really conscious of. What we have seen across the system is some reductions in admissions for assaults by a sharp object. That will be different across the country, but certainly in places we're seeing some reductions. And I know that many on the call will remember back to the public health approach that Scotland took towards knife crime a number of years ago, and how successful that is seen to have been. And actually, I know a number of police forces and other organisations across various systems look to that as best practice. But I suppose the important point with all of that background in mind is that particularly in Essex, we are trying to be preventative. We are trying to intervene early. That might not be before something happens, but it might be soon after something happens, to prevent future risk and future harm, both to those who carry knives and use knives, but also those around them as well. So I'll take you through a little bit around what we've done in this particular example. So hopefully you can see that what we really need to do is get ahead of the risks, and that's what we're trying to do. We need to spot those who might be at risk to themselves or others for knife crime, but most importantly, we need to help them. We know from so much academia and so much of our own experience that we have to be supportive in many cases if we're actually going to make a difference to those who are in that position. So what we developed was a model that helps us to identify individuals who are already in the system, either for involvement in knife-related incidents in the past or for involvement in other crime types, either as a suspect or a victim. But we want to identify those that we know about who we can help. And this was with a view to working really, really closely with partners, so that once we've identified those individuals, that cohort, we can then say to our partners, right, how can we support them? How can we tailor some measures that we can put around this person to make sure that they don't come to future harm or that they don't harm others, and really steer them either physically or metaphorically away from that risk. So what did we do in Essex? I won't read through the slide, I'll let you read that as I'm talking. We worked really closely with the University of Essex and developed essentially what is a risk-based intervention model. We used information from across our police systems, and we coupled that with a Cambridge Crime Harm Index. I know there'll be a number of you on the call who are familiar with that, but for those of you who aren't, the Cambridge Crime Harm Index, as like other harm indexes do, looks at all the offences that you could possibly record in policing and ranks them in terms of the level of sentencing you would get or could get, maximum sentencing you could get at court if that particular offence went to court. And essentially that produces a list of ranked harm, and we coupled that with the data that we got from our systems on offences linked to individuals. What we were really careful to do, though, is to take out data that could create some bias in the system. So the Chief has already commented when we talk about data ethics around the scrutiny that we face in policing when we use data, and bias is one of those areas that we're really scrutinised over. You might have seen any number of studies that might pick apart the data behind the results and say, but you know, you are biased towards ethnicity or you are biased towards gender. So we've been very careful with the data that we include. So we have at the moment taken out ethnicity. We've taken out possession of offensive weapons, because that's an offence that we tend to identify once we are already interacting with somebody, either from a stop search or an arrest. And so it's almost like a proactive offence that we find, and maybe not an indication of something that somebody's done that we might stumble upon, as it were. We take out domestic abuse instances, so that we remove the use of a knife that might be self-defence, or the use of a knife that might be opportunistic in other ways. We know that that's a really complex area to be looking at in itself, and we've got other things in that space that we're doing to understand that. We also remove data that's been generated by police applied mental health and drug markers. The reason for doing that is that we're not confident enough yet that we have enough consistency in how we apply those markers to know that actually it's a good gauge of whether, for instance, mental health was directly related to a particular knife crime incident. Once we're more confident with our data quality in that area, that's something that I think we'd like to bring in. So there's some of the areas that we were cautious of around bias and have removed. In terms of what we did use then, so we used data from 2019 onwards. I mentioned earlier that there was a recording change from 2019, so we've got a consistent set of data based on new roles. And we calculate various things. So we calculate the number of times an individual has had a positive knife occurrence, is what we've called it, as well as the number of peers associated with that occurrence. And that gives us an idea of the spread of that particular incident or that particular influence. So, for instance, we count the number of times an individual has been a suspect or a victim for selected offences, and that's broadly around violence, burglary and homicide, and that's what we describe in policing as high harm offences. So the offences that are going to cause most harm to individuals or to the community. We calculate an average harm score using the Cambridge Crime Harm Index that I mentioned against all of those offences that are against their name. And then we create a number of variables based on when that instance happened. So were they a victim or a suspect in the last 12 months, in the last 24 months, or not at all in the chosen period of time? And what those calculations do is it essentially gives us a list. It gives us a cohort of individuals who have generated the highest harm score with all of those calculations applied, and it gives us a probability that they may be involved in a knife-related offence in future. And it's that probability that we're really, really interested in. In terms of calculating that probability, for those of you who are interested, we use various very well-regarded statistical techniques, random forest methodology. Others were considered, but that's the one that we go with, and it's been very heavily evaluated and peer reviewed by those at the University of Essex. So we're really confident with the approach that we're taking. Then in terms of how we use the data, let me then move on to the next slide to talk about that. Has it moved on? In a minute. There we go. Hopefully you can see that. So how we use the data, once we've got that cohort of individuals, those highest harm, highest risk individuals, we provide that to our serious violence unit, who then start to work with partners on how we can support those individuals. And the really important point there is that it's tailored. It's very individual to the person, takes into account their circumstances, their offending history, their victimisation history. We know that those who offend are often victims as well. So where are the risks that are posed to them? It takes into account what a good outcome might be for them and what the context is of their wider surroundings. And you can see that some of the things that we can help with that are on the left-hand side of that slide. It might be accommodation, whether that's somebody who's being released from prison or somebody who simply needs to move away from a risk area. It might be that we help them with the cost of transport, with finding training and employment, and with other things that are listed on there as well. So it really can be anything within reason, obviously, and within our limits that helps that individual to start to move away from offending and from risk and harm that's associated with knife crime. And we have a number of successes that we can talk about. We are still in the early stages of releasing this. We've started small and we're looking to releasing it force wide. But even in that early phase, we've had a number of really good success stories around individuals who really needed our help and help across the system. So just by way of an example, we had an individual who was identified for weapons possession offences, as well as misuse of Class A drugs. Once we'd encouraged them to support with the programme, we were able to do things like provide a ring doorbell to them. So they were, what we identified is that they were at risk of cuckooing. Hopefully you'll all know what that is. And what that ring doorbell then did is it meant that we could identify future safeguarding risks, and it enabled us to respond very quickly when they then arose. So we took the issue, we identified that this individual was at risk from cuckooing, and that then enabled us to safeguard them better in the future. And that safeguarding is putting support around them to move away from the risk of knife crime. We had another individual who had a history of alcoholism and associated offending. They'd been denied a housing move through their own efforts, and what the partnership team were able to do is that they were able to apply for a joint panel housing referral, where their case was considered in more detail, and actually a decision was made to move them, relocate them out of the area, and to support their ongoing recovery. Again, an example of where we can really tailor the support to what the individual needs. That individual just needed to move away from the risk and from the potential harm into a new area, and we were able to facilitate that through the partnership. We have young people who found themselves engaging in criminality and knife carrying for their own safety, for their own safeguarding. We see that more and more often. And again, this was an example where somebody needed to move away from a troublesome area, somewhere where there weren't the same risk and harms, where there weren't the same individuals, and actually help them to find training, to find work. This particular individual, they do still offend, and that's something that's really important to flag. This particular programme doesn't necessarily stop dead all offending. That takes a really long time to do once it's embedded in somebody's lifestyle. But what we see in this example and other examples is that the harm associated with that offending reduces, the type of offending reduces, and their outlook improves. So they become more engaged in training, in education, and they see the value of moving into a lifestyle that doesn't involve offending, and particularly doesn't involve knives. And then finally, we have an example of somebody who was identified in the cohort when they were due for release from prison, and on release from prison, the team worked really closely with probation to find housing and employment. And again, that individual didn't actually remain in employment, but what they did do is test negative in all their drugs tests. They've agreed to wear a buddy tag, which hopefully you all know what that is, but as a deterrent measure, they identify that that's something that would help them to stop offending. So I think what these examples show is that once you've got the support around you, it's easier to desist and it's easier to move away from that risk and that harm. Like I say, we're in the early stages still, and if this is what we've achieved with very local rollouts, then I think the success stories are only going to keep coming as we go force wide. Like I've said, the key message is that these individuals don't necessarily stop offending straight away. It's the reduction in harm, it's the improvement in their behaviour and improvement in their level of risk, not just to themselves, but to others. And actually, it's making sure that they know that this can be a supportive system rather than one, particularly where policing is concerned, where we identify them and we manage them through policing and custody, that there are other options as well. And I suppose the point here, to bring it back to the question, is that we wouldn't be able to do this unless we were using data in an innovative way, unless we were being brave with taking personal data, looking at risk and being comfortable identifying a cohort of individuals. And there are wider benefits as well. There's benefits across the system, and I'm sure these are probably quite self-explanatory, but reduce the risk for an individual, you reduce the risk that's in the system, you reduce the risk to other people. We share that burden of trying to prevent and intervene with our partners, and actually we start to head towards more appropriate and more successful outcomes that probably have greater longevity than if we would simply arrest these individuals all the time and deal with them just in policing. It would be really good if we could show the cost benefits of this as well, and it's something that we're working on. Just by way of an estimate, if you take the case of an individual who was supported to change their name, move location due to their associations with crime, we estimate, using a Home Office cost of crime tool, that we could save around £600,000 per individual, and that's based on the cost of officers having to be deployed for arrests, officers spending time investigating, but also fees with the courts, prisoner detainee costs, but also medical costs, intervention costs as well. So it's that preventative cost that we'd really like to understand a bit more as well, and that's something that we'll work towards as we roll out a bit further. So just to round off this particular case study, as you can see on the slide, you can imagine that there are a number of challenges, and the Chief has already touched on some of these with this particular example, a lot of which arise from the fact that we were using personal data. So in policing, as soon as we do anything with person level data, we need to be really careful that we're doing it for the right reason, in the right way, hence the really close working with our university colleagues at the University of Essex. So they're on the slide, you can read them. Data quality, data skills, actually being able to do what we want to do in the first place is a challenge in itself. Refining the model, that's a challenge. What we started with isn't what we have now, and it will be a process of refining to make sure we continue to be satisfied with what we're generating and how we're using that information. Data availability, we can only use what we've got, and as we develop in policing and across the system, bringing in new data systems, bringing in new capability, we have to have data at the front and centre of our thinking with every new piece that we bring in, so that we do have access to what we need going forward. And then at the end, it probably should be at the beginning, and the Chief's already touched on it, but data ethics. The use of algorithms in policing, like I've said, is hotly contested in places, and the camp is definitely split between those who see the value of it and those who see it as a danger. I would say that this particular case study, this particular model that we've implemented, is a really good example of how algorithmic-based decision-making in policing can be very successful, but you need all of those safeguardings around it. And for us, that included taking the proposal through our ethics committee, through our data ethics committee, as well as, like I said, that continued engagement with academics who are experts in that space. But if we're honest, it's unavoidable. We have to be innovative with data if we are going to be better at predicting and preventing and intervening. We can't know this without using data in this way in the background. But the other big challenge, which isn't on the slide and probably should be, as well as data ethics, equally, is appetite from partners to share data, and we're making really, really good progress here. We have the data declaration that many of you will be familiar with, which really sets out an intention across the partnership to share data that will be helpful to exactly this type of complex challenge, complex problem, but we need more of it. What we really need for this model is health data, education data, probation data, anything that would help us refine the risks that we're looking at and refine that probability score that we're applying to individuals. So really that's what we've learned, that's the impact. And in terms of what next, like I said, we're refining this for further rollout. With that will come more evaluation, and actually on top of that, the Home Office are really interested in what we're doing in Essex. So there's a real drive centrally in UK government to see what we can do with preventative policing in this particular space, and they see the Essex model that I've described here as being promising practice. So we're really closely engaged with the College of Policing just to see what opportunities there are there, whether they would like to run a peer review on this process, and it's really interesting and exciting to see where that might go. Obviously, maybe the elephant in the room is the fact that the algorithms and the use of algorithms in policing is on a spectrum, isn't it? And this particular type of algorithm based decision making might be at one end, and then at the other end we have live facial recognition, which again the camp is definitely split on. And actually that's something that we're interested in Essex, because we are innovative, we do want to use data as effectively as possible, but we want to do it in the most responsible way. So that's something that we're actively looking at and taking into account everything that we need to around ethics and safeguarding. So one example of how we've used data better at a very personal level to manage and mitigate risk with individuals, and because of that across the wider system. Another slightly shorter example of how we've used data in a similar way though, kind of profiling our decision making. Let me just move on to the next slide, it's being a bit slow. So this is with hotspot policing, and this might be a bit familiar to you all really. So like knife crime, hotspot policing isn't actually new at all, and you might have heard of it in a number of different ways. There's a few on the slide there: high visibility policing, problem oriented policing, directed patrols, proactive arrest. It's all about tackling an issue by being there, essentially, and all based in the concept that a disproportionately high volume and proportion of crime takes place in a very small geography for a whole variety of reasons, and those reasons are going to be cross-system. So it's not just going to be crime levels, it's going to be housing, it's going to be socio-economic challenges, it's going to be other social issues that contribute to that. But that's what it's centred around. And the hypothesis is that simply being present in that space deters offending or mitigates offending, or means that we're able to intervene when we see offending escalating or potentially beginning. You'll see a case study on the slide. So Essex Police were identified way back in 2020, 2021 to be a pilot force for this. So it's something that the Home Office identified as being an issue, particularly around serious violence. I should have said that this particular example is around serious violence. So the Home Office identified Essex as a pilot force to try something in this space. So they gave us quite a considerable amount of funding to develop this approach, and that's what I'm going to talk through. And as you can see already by that headline on the bottom left of the slide, the pilot that we ran back then had a really considerable impact on the level of serious violence in a particular area of Essex. The focus from the Home Office really began, if you want, back in 2019 when Boris Johnson set out a range of measures, a range of targets for policing. And one of those was around serious violence. And in particular, you don't hear about it so much now, but in particular, he said that serious violence had to reduce by 20% over the subsequent 3 years. And that was one of the things that really generated this approach to hotspot policing around serious violence. And actually, the pilot that we ran in 2021 has almost been converted into a well-regarded piece of academic research done by one of our officers in Essex that shows that it generated that incredibly impressive outcome. So the specifics of it were that an area of geography that was the size of 20 metres by 150 metres squared, 20 of those hotspots were patrolled on a day-on, day-off rota, finding that 41% of the harm was covered was covered in those areas, contained in those areas, but harm from serious violence was 88.5% lower on the experimental days than on the days where there were no patrols. So a lot of the harm, 41% of overall harm in those areas in the first place, and on the days where we patrolled in those areas, that reduced by 88.5%, which is a significant reduction and goes to show how successful it was. So what we did, fairly simple on paper, we identified 15 treatment zones essentially. So this was using violent crime data from the previous 3 years. We identified 15 treatment zones that contained the highest level of harm, and we also identified 15 control zones. And essentially, we put a patrolling requirement around those treatment zones, and it means that officers go into that zone for a short period of time. They're visible, they're there for the public to engage with, to communicate with, and they, like I said, they act as a deterrent as well as an engagement preventative intervention tool as well. We were really careful to remove domestic abuse from those offences. It's really important to separate public serious violence from private serious violence. The two require very different policing approaches. So this was very much focused on that public serious violence. We treated a variety of zones across as many districts as we could do with different demographics, but mostly they're close to town centres, due to the distribution of violent crime. So we'll know that a lot of violent crime happens in more built up areas than it might do in rural areas. And those directed patrols in those treatment areas is 15 minutes per hotspot. So it's not a huge amount of time. And like I said, it's really based in very solid research that shows even that short period of time can lead to a really positive impact on crime and disorder and preventing it in the first place. What's important to say, apologies, is that in the case study that I'm talking about, that was an extension of the original pilot. So the original pilot was very focused in Southend. We've now extended that as an ongoing piece of work across Essex, and for each consecutive year, we've received more funding from the Home Office to extend it even further. So for next year, we've just had the funding confirmed. So in terms of impact, at the moment, we're still seeing what is statistically significant and what isn't, and our understanding of that will develop as we continue to progress. But what we do see is we do see differences in the harm between treatment zones, control zones, and actually the wider force and the wider district that we're operating in. We try to account for variations in crime trends, so accepting that some areas have a different crime profile anyway, and being able to compare, we need to make sure that we're accounting for that. But we are seeing differences in the level of harm and the level of offending, which is really, really promising. We are still understanding the wider benefits of hotspot policing. For instance, around dispersing crime, we need to understand the impact that it has on neighbouring areas. And the College of Policing are working really closely with forces to help us do that. But generally, it's widely accepted that hotspot policing, and particularly what we've done in Essex Police, has a very positive impact. And again, not just for that specific geographical area, but the wider community and the wider county. In terms of challenges that we faced, we can't account for other external impacting factors, so general crime trends, hyperlocal incidents, the weather. You know that the weather often affects offending. We can't control everything. What we can do is take it into account. And there's a little bit of the ethical question here as well. You know, even though we're not using personal data, we are profiling an area, and again, that has received some scrutiny in the past. You know, people are concerned that when we target a particular geographic area, we are targeting the people within that area. And what we're really clear on here is no, we are targeting the geography because of the crime that's in that space, and we want to support the area in reducing that crime. But there is that ethical question, even though it's not person-based data. So, like I said, in terms of what next. The Home Office have expanded the funding for serious violence, but also expanded the concept to ASB. So in Essex, we do hotspot policing for serious violence and for ASB, and they're really complementary. We're very careful about where we do each so that we can make sure we're having the right impact, but very complementary of each other. And actually, if we think about this approach, we could apply it in so many different ways as well. So many other cross-system challenges. For ASB, we're working really closely with our partners, and that's exactly where this data-driven approach could be really beneficial. So a slightly shorter example there, but again, evidence of how if we use data sensibly and responsibly, we can really start to target and address some core issues for policing. So just before I hand you back over to the Chief, just a quick bit on how we're preparing ourselves a bit more in Essex Police for this data-driven future. So we're working on developing our data strategy and our data culture. There's some really big pieces of work going on in Essex Police to transform how we capture, how we store, how we use data, and that's a piece of work that will take us over a number of years. We remain absolutely committed to growing the right collaborations, and I touched on it with the first case study where I said that we need more data to help with that risk and harm reduction. We're so collaborated to working with you across the system in order to get that, and we hope and we need you to be committed to that too, and we think you are. We're investing wisely, so thinking about what the challenges are going to be coming over the horizon. We've talked a little bit about algorithms, there's artificial intelligence, there's robotic process automation. We need to make sure that we're investing to make best use of our data. And we're really re-energising the wider research and innovation agenda, because data is only one small part of that. Believe it or not, there's a whole lot else going on in that space as well. And we want to make sure that we're capturing data and everything else in how we do research and innovation. So hopefully a couple of examples that show you how we're using data in Essex Police and what we're doing moving forward. And I'm going to hand back over to the Chief. I'll move on to the next slide for you.
Thanks, Fiona, and hopefully, some really good examples there of what we're doing in terms of that. And just 2 points around it. You'll see the next slide there. Examples where we have broadened our use of data. It's not just about catching offenders, but about preventing harm. And I think the first case point example is to show that some of those people didn't stop offending, but the level and the nature and the harm they caused to themselves and others reduced, and that was noticeable in the Cambridge Harm Index, and so Fiona said assessed and peer reviewed by University of Essex to turn around and say actually it had a positive impact on their behaviour. They're still not going to be the kind of person that the Chief Constable is going to invite around for lunch, but actually, hopefully, they're not causing as much harm to themselves and their community. And the second one, and the hotspot stuff. That was actually developed through risk terrain modelling through the evidence-based policing programme with Cambridge by one of our superintendents at the time, with Professor Larry Sherman, using some work from Chicago and work that had been done in America. So that whole programme started from the broadened use of data in Essex, which has now become a national programme, and you've seen some of the results. It's having a huge impact and positive impact both here in Essex and across the country, hence the funding. But the data sharing, Fiona said it, to quote, we're not just after data to lock people up. It's about data for insights to see how do we then face those challenges together. Some of the things that Fiona's shown around not necessarily a criminal justice intervention, other interventions, which is not always policing, perhaps community voluntary sector, other safeguarding avenues, and other people. And that's, the knife crime vulnerability model has shown how we've worked together. And some may say that's not a role for policing, but if I go back to the principle of policing, prevention is better than cure. Judge us on the absence of crime, as Peel said back in 1829. So it's an important how we do that. But we need your support, and we need to work together on that. And it is about cementing trust. That stuff that you can and share, and the data declaration, which I know all the chief execs across have signed, including myself, and I know health partners are doing the same, and that's making sure that we do use that data for the purpose that the public would want, which is to keep them safer, to improve their outcomes and well-being. So some good examples about how we want to do that. So I think if we just flick forward to the last slide, but the point I'd make is we've seen it before. Data's been around a long time, and for those of you, I can't see everyone on the thing, but some of you may remember Tom Cruise and Minority Reports, some real stuff about how do we predict crime and make sure that we do that. So those, I'm not sure we're ever going to get quite to that, where people are there dreaming it and then telling us where to go so we can intervene. The second point, the imitation game, and I'm sure you'll all be aware of that film and the story behind that. But some of this is slow, methodical, and detailed work. And anyone who knows the story of Enigma and certainly seen the film, that didn't come straight first. So it was about the small but important gains to give insight, which of course we know the outcome are there. And of course we've got to be careful. The great hack, Cambridge Analytica. We saw that scandal. It's on Netflix if you want to watch it. Not a plug there by any means, but just about how we've got to be careful about making sure we're using that data in a way that's proper and ethical. But the last one, and it is a good film, Moneyball, to do, and just about some of this is not about great and huge impacts. This is not transformational, but the story in that is, how a lower league baseball player uses data analytics to, with no money, a college football team, a college baseball team rises and really excels by using data in a very, very informed way to get the best out of the resources they have to achieve that, which was to winning college baseball, but in fact was data analytics. So we've been there before. It's not new stuff, but obviously we see the challenges that we've got. So thank you for listening to us. I think we've got a bit of time for questions around those, but hopefully that's given you a bit of an insight into how we're using data around evidence-based policing to reduce harm.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Vijay, and thank you very much, Fiona. Really, really great session. Some great comments I'm hearing around kind of the inspiration and case studies that you've shared. We do have a couple of questions in the chat. I'll pitch to you. So, what have you observed as being the biggest ethical challenges in evidence-based approaches to complex systems, and what can we all learn from that together?
Well, I'll let Fiona go first, and then I've got a view as well. Fiona.
I'm going to go quite broad with this. The biggest ethical challenge is the impact on people and the unintended consequence on people, and it's concern that, quite rightly, whether it's professionals or academics or the wider society has, that using our data, because we're policing, will mean that somebody might be identified, somebody might be wrongly put in the frame for something. That's absolutely not our intention. And we always very unhelpfully draw comparisons with the amount of data that Tesco's have on you, or Sainsbury's have on you, or Waitrose have on you, wherever you shop, they have an awful lot of data on you, and they spam you all the time, telling you stuff that they think they know about you, and where you might want to shop and what you might want to buy. And we don't have a problem with that. But when it comes to using data to keep people safe, there's also an inherent risk, or so it seems, that we might use that in another way. And for us, that's our biggest challenge. And I say that because I think that's what's been preventing us being able to use data more effectively across the system, and people wanting to feed into that process.
And Nikki, I think, I always summarise it as the could versus should argument. And of course the data is available. Now, if we're our intrusion and our proportionality around the use of data, where it's going to prevent someone from losing their life, I think there's a greater deal of tolerance, and we'd be more intrusive around that data, to stop someone being stabbed or committing a homicide, murdering someone. And of course, it's pertinent at the moment because, if you look at the freedom of speech and protest, for example, well, all of the same tactics and data we could use to analyse to prevent a murder, or homicide, or domestic abuse case, well, we could use those same tactics to identify a person who's going to protest, for example, outside a member of Parliament's home. Now, the question for me is, of course we could do that, but should we do that? And of course, you get to the same tactics can be used for crimes in some cases, or indeed issues that are just unpopular. And I think policing has to tread a very careful line. Where it's prevent someone dying, I think it's really, really clear. Where you get to that line somewhere there, where the grey area about what is the thing you're trying to prevent, and how much does that necessitate the intrusion into people's personal data very often.
Yeah, great points. And I think the quote around "just because we could doesn't mean we should" is really important. We do have a session coming up later today on navigating ethical and responsible uses of innovation. So sign up to that if you've not and you want to hear more. We've got a data ethics committee as well that ecda have got, which is an independent panel made up of multiple different kind of experts, and they help us to think through those things. They help us to think through some of the questions that we might not have considered, and kind of the good framework that we've kind of deployed in Essex around kind of helping us to think through those things throughout the life cycle of a project, which I've found incredibly helpful within the work that we've done. So we've got another question from Hannah. So the case study is very interesting and seem like great examples of how data can actually enact positive change. She'd be interested to know how the public or what the internal reception has been like to the use of kind of data analytics as part of kind of decision making.
Well, if I take that one first, if I can, Fiona, and so there's two discrete projects. What we have done and working through a company called Agilysys. You know, we've developed a thing called analytics for everybody. And what we're trying to say is, how do we put the ability to analyse data and use data to inform your daily work in the hands of operational colleagues and frontline colleagues? So, you know, we've got a team of, you know, analysts, performance and business analysts who are doing some complex stuff. But actually now my officers and staff at every level can go in on a daily basis and look at what is the data and information that's available. So where should I patrol today? What crimes happened yesterday? Is there an increasing trend in this element or that element? How am I, you know, where are the pinch points or elements around that? So I think one of the things that we're trying to say is, how do you, you know, put the data or the access to the data in the hands of the people who can make operational decisions in whatever role that is, whether it's business process, we've got some examples of dashboards allowing to do that, or indeed, you know, operational crime issues, which allows, whether it's a constable, a police staff member, to say, actually, do you know what's happened? And I can do that trend over a week, a month, a year, and I can then start to make informed decisions about how I deliver service for the public. So I think it is, you know, they call it that democratisation. I'm not sure I like that word particularly, but I think it's about putting data in the hands of the people who can use it, and then the experts, you know, those who can do the advanced data analytics can then focus on those perhaps more ethical and challenging issues and inform projects like Fiona's taken today. So it's been well received. You know, when I speak to frontline supervisors, they like the idea of being able to say, actually, what's changed from yesterday to today? How does that change what I do in terms of the service I deliver to the public? But I know that, Fiona, you'll have a view as well, I'm sure.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. There's definitely an energy and appetite for data, and of course with that we need to make sure that doesn't run away in the wrong direction. But actually, if we don't have that culture and we don't have that appetite in the first place, we won't get anywhere. Interestingly, one of the I skimmed the PSNI report, so Police Service for Northern Ireland, that they've had a report into their data breach that took place last year, and one of the recommendations within that report is for PSNI specifically, but for police to think about how they're engaging their communities in their actual use of data in a strategic sense. So some of you will know that we have independent advisory groups for many issues in policing, and the question that was posed in that particular recommendation is, should we be having that sort of advisory group for our use of data? If it's going to be driving so much of what we do, how can we really bring the community on board with how we use data, not just our academic partners? So that's not something that actually I've given consideration to until now, but I think it's a really good question and might be something that policing thinks about in future. But hopefully, you know, if you were to ask those individuals who, particularly those who had received intervention from the knife crime vulnerability work, they would be grateful that we use their data in the way that we did, because they're now on a better path. So and that's that kind of satisfaction, that confidence in what we're doing. I think that's the best test.
Nice, excellent. And I have to say that the ecda done some research a couple of years ago now, just about what our residents think about use of data sharing. And actually, I think kind of there was a lot of comments around, I'm surprised you're not already sharing this information. We thought you were sharing this information. So I think we're probably slightly more kind of behind the curve around kind of our residents' understanding and levels of awareness about how we operate between organisations. Our people don't live within organisational boundaries, so kind of we shouldn't do either, really, when we think about use of data sharing as part of the norm, not the exception. So I think we've got time for one more question. There's one from kind of Alistair in the chat. The knife crime work is really interesting and lots of applications to other areas. They wanted a clarification question. Did the model only use individuals that were already known to the police, or what might you do to think about kind of first-time offenders that may be not known to kind of any organisations, and that might be in relation to the proportion of knife crime that's committed by first-time offenders?
I'll leave that one for you, Fiona.
Oh, thanks. So yes, by the nature of taking data from our systems, it was individuals that we had, for whatever reason, recorded on our system. Now, it might not be, like I said, as a suspect of something. It might be that they were a peer of somebody, that they were a victim of something themselves. But yes, it would be somebody who's already in our system. That's where partnership data becomes so vital, because it might be that an individual is known to every other partner than policing, and we have no sight of them. As soon as we join that data up, we have a much richer picture. We might find that they're right at the top of our cohort list, and we would never have otherwise known about them. So at the moment, yes, it's who we have in our system, and like I said, we can only work with what we've got. But that demonstrates why we need additional data as well from partners.
And Nikki, if I can give an indication, and all of you will have seen the tragic death of Ashley Wadsworth in Chelmsford, killed, the Canadian woman who came over here, killed by Jack Seppel, matter of public record, who's now serving a sentence. And of course, that individual was known to many other agencies, but not to policing. And I'm not suggesting that, that data sharing would have prevented that tragedy, but certainly, that's inspired some work with, EPUT, Essex Partnership University Trust, and with social care to make sure we're sharing more discrete data to identify those people who are the most risk to themselves and others. So I think, I know that, I'm a data controller. I've got a CSIRO who's there, and I've got data protection officers doing their best here, make sure that Essex Police doesn't end up in court or indeed, fined or whatever else. But I think there is about being courageous, and in a risk-aware way to say, how do we share that data that tells us about the individual that perhaps policing doesn't know about and they're a threat in terms of violence or harm, that health doesn't know about, that policing does know, that is a help to themselves, or there's here that social care, adult or child, doesn't know about, but perhaps health knows about. That's the benefit around the sharing element, because it allows us all to interpret risk and then decide what it is we would like to do to reduce whatever that harm is. And I think there's some good, we see some good examples, and there's lots of work in the background. There's other bits. That's a good example around our high risk cohort that we're working with health around. But data sharing is, and it's difficult sometimes because we've all been taught to protect it. But actually, I think the point is, your point from the survey, from people, is we need to use it, and the public, would expect us to be doing that to keep them safe and to make their lives better.
Excellent, brilliant. Well, thank you very much.